This is episode 196 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico podcast. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. Wally, another week of quarantine, although we are slowly starting to see reopenings. I think golf courses was a welcome sign. I can say that I've taken advantage of that particular aspect numerous times here in the last week or so. And, just we're all waiting May 15th. And the governor's initial, I don't know what the latest
The
is.
next round, the next
round,
chapter.
Yes. We're all sitting with fingers crossed, bated breath, hoping that she follows through and starts to, again, open the economy up.
Yeah, what is open and what are the rules under which things do? And there are many industries, the restaurant, hospitality industry. There's others that are hoping that there will be some movement in that regard. And I look at the 5-day average, moving average, and that seems like it looks positive. But this is a day-to-day thing. So, who knows what's going to happen, but there's a lot of consternation on all sides of this issue. It doesn't matter whether you think that we should have been opened up already or if you think that we should keep the economy closed down forever. There's a constituency, and this is just another example of the bifurcated nature politically of where our country is. And I was reading some statistics, and it really comes down very strong into this in terms of how fearful you are of the virus, what you think the proper path forward is. And it's creating a huge challenge, no question about that.
Yeah. Speaking as a libertarian-leaning, free market conservative guy, I never thought that this kind of concern would be expressed among people of the opposite side. Typically, a lot of times, you'll have a lot of objections to X, Y, and Z freedom coming about, and then when it actually comes about, people on both sides kind of say, "Oh, that made sense all
the time." Yeah.
Well, in this, you are seeing people who just want to be able to go out and live their lives, the openers, if you will, who are saying, look, if you don't want to go out, don't want to go back to work, don't want to do whatever, you have the freedom to do that, but don't hinder my freedom to go back. And you have that bifurcation. Nobody is saying you have to go out, you have to live your life a certain way on the open side. It's the closed side that is constantly, to me, saying, you can't do this, you can't do that. You have to live in something resembling the same level of fear as I do. And it really kind of rattled the entire cage of my world outlook in terms of that aggressive of an attitude among people who it's not good enough that they have the freedom to stay home. It's that everybody needs to stay home. And we could talk about the pluses and minuses and the health and data and all that kind of stuff, but it's a really interesting dichotomy there.
Yeah, and to the best of my knowledge, everything I've read is this is the first pandemic that quarantines the healthy. And so this is, and I was also thinking about this, is this some sort of a basically made for the 24-hour cable news cycle, made for social media response? Or was the fact that this thing started out in China and then they set the basically the template for how you would respond to this, and the rest of the world just followed along? But we do find ourselves in, extremely interesting times. And, without a doubt, the decisions that are made and need to be made at every level they're profound in terms of their impact. I was just trying to think the other day, there's this false dichotomy, and I call it as a false dichotomy. It's not a question of whether you're for people dying from COVID or for helping the economy to restore. I say it, and I truly believe it. The economy is that sustains life. And so it's not like the economy is this thing that you can put on a shelf and it will always be there. I have a feeling that from a small business point of view, just I ran some numbers. I don't have anything approaching ready for analysis, but it's almost like every week or two that a small business is closed, that may be adding a year or two until you get that same level of recovery because of just the nature. Things are going to go out of business. Things are going out of business. And also we're starting...
Sweet Tomatoes, one of my favorite family restaurants.
Gone.
I mean, the whole buffet model of restaurant, you got to question.
Yeah, you got to question that.
That'll ever come back. And it's not alone. I mean, I have kids. I have 3 kids. Kids, by their nature, are little germ-carrying creatures. Now, in the terms of the coronavirus, it's actually questionable just how much kids can even spread that virus. And these are all scientific questions I don't have the answers to. But like Chuck E. Cheese, that's a petri dish right there. Chuck E. Cheese, and God love them, my kids love Chuck E. Cheese.
Yes.
Is that a place that's going to be able to reopen? There's so many environments like that I fear we may just have completely lost in the blink of an eye without ever being able to say goodbye. I mean, Sweet Tomatoes is one of the our family's go-to places. You could feed a family relatively healthy food for relatively cheap, and boom.
Yeah, and you're talking about things that just because of the separation structurally, and we've talked things like the cruise line industry, public transportation. I read an article today that said automobiles will lead energy production back because people, and not in the United States, in places like China and Asia, are saying, no, I'm not getting on public transportation. All of a sudden, it doesn't look too bad to sit in traffic for 2 hours, given what's going on. So there are a whole lot of structural things like that. But they say save some money for a rainy day, but it's the few and far between the business that's not going to be dramatically impacted by not being able to do any business, having no revenue come in for months and months and months. So we are in a very tenuous situation, and I don't want to minimize the process that goes into making these decisions, and I don't question the sincerity of people who do it, but I do question whether there's this idea that this economy is just this thing that you take off the shelf whenever you want. We're seeing, food, shelter, clothing. People seem like they're fine talking about shortening the supply chains from China back to the U.S. They seem pretty comfortable with that idea for medicine, things like protective equipment, the masks and the like. But somehow it seems like they don't want to have the discussion about all these other businesses that do all these things for us every day. If they're all out of business, what happens? And what happens to those people? And what happens to the institutions that are disadvantaged, weakened, and maybe are bankrupt themselves? So we are in tough shape no matter how things go forward. And I think these next couple of weeks for New Mexico will be crucial in terms of how things go for us long term. Now, having said that, who knows? Will there be, my sense is that is the case.
Well, let's get to a few items here. One is New Mexico does have a reopening plan. It was produced by the governor's office on April the 30th, but not released to much fanfare. Obviously, that was, when we got to the golf course opening, etc. We have it posted for you at airsofenchantment.com on May 7th. Is this Governor Lujan Grisham's reopening plan, and why hasn't she made it public yet? Because while she had opened the golf courses and everything, she hadn't really explained a full-fledged plan. And so now we have a plan. It's got a lot of data. It's got a lot of information. And it goes out till, through June. It's got 3 phases. There's so many interesting aspects to this whole plan. One is New Mexico moves forward as one state, which she has the state broken up into 5 different regions, but as we've seen, she's not treated Southeast New Mexico, Lincoln County, whatever, any differently than most other areas of the state. She's treated Gallup differently, and that's an interesting point that we can address in just a second. But there's no county by county kind of aspect to this. So she's got various phases. You can read through exactly what they mean, starting initially there in early May, mid-May, early June, and on to phase 3 in early July. Will May 15th be a dividing line here? Will we see the state really start to open up? That is very much an open question, and we'll be able to talk about that on next week's podcast. Wally, another, and we talked about the regions. Of course, the city of Gallup has been in an extreme version of a lockdown. And as the Journal, the Albuquerque Journal had an op-ed, and I think they presciently, but it was almost more of a political calculation to discuss it this way. But it's not Gallup that the governor's really shutting down. It's the Navajo coming into Gallup that the governor is putting the kibosh on by shutting down Gallup. And the head sentence of the Journal's editorial from, this is Sunday, was, and I'll read directly, Governor Lujan Grisham's lockdown of Gallup, which was set to expire at noon today, was an extreme measure. In reality, it was a lockout of people from the Navajo Nation, where the pandemic has devastated the population. And I think that's the interesting thing, is because Gallup is one of those cultural and economic centers for folks off the reservation, and the virus, we know, for a variety of reasons, has been an extreme problem up there. It's not something that a lot of people were willing to recognize, but the Journal did note that it was basically Navajo can't come in and shop every weekend, and that's where the virus is coming from. And it's tragic, it's sad, it's unfortunate, but at least the Journal was willing to state that publicly.
Yeah, and that is a good example. And now we're seeing, because of that, because the people from the reservation can't come in and shop, there's having to be massive efforts to bring food, water, medicine, and supplies out to the reservation.
As should be done.
Well, no, but what I'm saying is that economies and market economies move goods and services around, and if you take away the ability to do that, there's a lot of consequences. And as we've seen in things like rural hospitals and now on the Navajo Nation, those impacts happen quicker than anyone ever would think would. Mm-hmm. And the history of political decision making seems like its unintended consequences is always a huge part of it. But even I was taken aback at the impacts in areas that I never would have been able to, off the top of my head say, oh, well, what about this, this, and this? And by having things shut down, there are a lot of impacts.
And there are, but if you change the dynamic and say much of the rest of New Mexico can open up as new normal, you've got nursing homes and Navajo reservations, particular problems, and how do we address those? It changes the dynamic entirely away from we're all off on the sidelines in terms of the economy, paying taxes, etc., to we have a few areas that really need to be focused on rehabilitating, get them the appropriate resources that they need to survive, and then hopefully move beyond the virus situation. It's just a different philosophy. It's not necessarily been done the way I think we would like to see, especially had we to do it over. Notably as well, Eddy County has sued the governor for what they're calling unfair emergency orders. I don't know that the lawsuit has a lot of potential in terms of a win, because the governor, she has very dictatorial powers under New Mexico state law, but kind of filing a lawsuit is a good indicator that you're serious.
And that you are not happy from a political aspect, no doubt about that.
Yeah. And then I know, Wally, we've had a lot of things to talk about here with this very early part of our discussion, but there's a editorial or a opinion editorial that I know chilled me to the bone, and rarely do Albuquerque Journal editorials have that kind of chilling effect on me. I don't know.
Even your own?
No, mine are wonderful and glorious, but I could sit through Bernie Sanders editorials or Elizabeth Warren, but Dr. Yibing Lee, an Albuquerque physician, Saturday, it was avoid a second wave, extend New Mexico's stay-at-home order. Actually, this was, I think, Sunday. Anyway, he describes himself as a family practice physician in Albuquerque, clearly on the left, talking about how we needed Medicare for all and universal basic income. But he is encouraging Governor Lujan Grisham to extend the stay-at-home order until at least June the 15th. And I don't think anyone listening to the sound of my voice wants to see that. But boy, you got to wonder what kind of influence this guy might have with the Lujan Grisham administration.
Yeah, and I read that as well, and I was like, wow. Yeah, to think of having things as they are now for 2 more months. And, they're...
Well, June. That'd be 1 month. 1 month. And...
Oh, yeah. Well, yes. Well, thank you.
But he's certainly seemed amenable to going further.
Yeah, well, keep it closed forever, basically, is where I was going. Yes. No, you're right. Thank you. 1 month and 4 days from where we are today. That is very interesting. And there are many people that have speculated with this sort of pandemic, that when things do open up and when the late fall, winter weather return, there may be an uptick as well. And so that's, just because things open up doesn't mean that we always stay wherever we are. But to follow up on the point you made, it's interesting. It seems like there is a comfort in making differentiations regionally in New Mexico, particularly with the situation, Gallup and the Navajo Nation going tighter, but not being more loose where the data would look like it would support it. And I have heard the argument, well, people will travel. Well, let me just say that, just for example, if Lovington opens up and they have no rules, God love Lovington. I'm not picking on them, even though I kind of am. I'm not driving from Albuquerque to Lovington to go to a diner. It's just not going to happen. And so, yes, do people move around a little bit? More of the issue might have to do with, is El Paso open up relative to Las Cruces? Is West Texas open up relative to Hobbs and Lovington and that east part of the state? Is Colorado open up relative to the northern part? I think that's more of an issue. I think that, people are not traveling this time of year to go for a shopping spree in another part of the state that's more open, that can basically open a few clothing stores so people can maybe get some clothes that they need for the summer. I just don't see that is happening in the short term. I could be wrong, but I just think that is that argument from we're all in this and we have to do everything the same across the entire state of New Mexico. It would be different if we were a small, uniform state. We're very broad, very diverse. Things are very different.
Well, I might not be heading to Lovington for
a cheeseburger.
However, for a live band and a beer and an outdoor patio, I think I could be convinced to drive to Ruidoso.
Okay, that is probably the case. But you were not going to get this chance, so you might have to drive to Lubbock. So
that is true.
Where it's a cool breeze in the late spring there in Lubbock. So,
so now moving on to more of the economic side of things, Governor Lujan Grisham, basically her first significant utterance about the New Mexico economy in one of her press conferences or discussions of where we're heading economically was, well, we might want to tap the permanent fund, the land grant permanent fund, which has been what the left has been after for a decade now to fund early childhood education. Uh, yeah, there's a process there, and it's actually more questionable than I thought as to exactly what needs to be done. But we know you need a vote of the people. We know we need legislative action. Exactly what kind of congressional action is maybe a little ambiguous. But this isn't just a let's pass it and we go cash the check the next day. But John Arthur Smith has been, of course, the defender of the permanent fund, and I was able to tune into his interview on the Bob Clark Show on KOB radio. Pretty stoutly pushed back against the idea that we're going to tap the permanent fund right away to address the budget issue.
Yeah, and I was reading a Santa Fe, New Mexican article, and there was a comment that I was unable to completely follow up with because I don't have access to a full law library, either online, but to say that they had attempted to do some general fund allocations out of that in the 50s and the court struck it down. So it's interesting. That's not confirmed, but the whole thing about lots of steps have to happen for this, and in all likelihood to totally change it and make it just for general fund sort of things would probably literally require an act of Congress, because that land grant permanent fund goes back to a long time back into the time when New Mexico became a state and how all that's managed. So,
yeah, and it gets back to the issue of, are we going to cut spending? And the new numbers came out. They're no better or worse than anything we've seen in recent weeks. John Arthur Smith kind of nailed the situation at the beginning, saying we're looking at a $2 billion deficit. The latest projections show we're facing 1.8 billion to 2.4 billion. So you average that out, and we're a little above $2 billion in terms of the gap. They're looking at revenues of 5.5 to 6.1 billion dollars, which, Martinez's last budget was 6.3. So we're talking, as we talked a month ago, we are looking at a potential budget moving forward that could be less than where Susana Martinez's last budget was, which isn't crisis mode situation in terms of the size of government. There's certainly plenty of cuts and reductions to be made, and we're working on that right now at the Rio Grande Foundation. It's the political will to address that, and obviously the governor immediately floating the idea of the permanent fund, despite all the obstacles to doing that, is an indicator that she's not really inclined to jump into I'm going to start cutting the programs that I just got the last 2 years that I've kind of staked my political future on. She's still looking for alternatives. I think there's a famous line, I forget who it was, but he's carrying around a Bible, and he's kind of a ne'er-do-well type, and he says, what the other guy says to him, why do you carry around that Bible? And he says, well, I'm looking for loopholes. And that's what the governor's doing right now when it comes to the budget. She hasn't quite come to grips with reality here.
No, there's no question about that. And I think there is a lot of denial and then a lot of basically political timing going on. We're starting to see organizations like the Albuquerque Public Schools, the city of Santa Fe doing furloughs and cost containment items. We don't see even much of a discussion about that. And that's the other thing that is interesting, is that this argument, and I've seen it in the media, and I see it at places where people are saying, well, all we need to work on is COVID-19 and coronavirus. We can't think of anything else. And I just don't think that that's a rational take. We live in a complex economy, complex society. A lot of things have to happen. And, I hate necessarily using the war analogy. It kind of gets overused. But in war, yes, you might have your overall strategic thing that's most important at any given time, but you can't let smaller things that are smaller today fall off the table. They will become the thing that's going to really get you in the not too distant future. And I think that's an issue that people need to be taking a look at. And maybe they're having meeting after meeting. They're spending a huge amount of time in Santa Fe trying to figure that out, but there has not been much of a public discussion coming out of Santa Fe with regard to that.
Which brings me to Trevor's cartoon in the Sunday Albuquerque Journal, where the governor's behind closed doors. She's the role of the doctor, and people are trying to find out what's going on, how's the patient, and she's claiming HIPAA rules and patient privacy. She's definitely keeping things in lockdown mode in terms of information available to the public. And that's all going to change when the legislature convenes. You can't keep a secret with 112 people. The legislature is a much more open institution, whether they do a great job or not. And so, we'll just have to see how where things go as we get towards a special session in June. Now, on the issue of budget cuts, the Santa Fe New Mexican, which is a pretty darn liberal editorial board, they had a editorial on May the 9th. New Mexico can't cut its way out of this fix. They, of course, bring up the permanent funds. They make some, it's just funny the way people think sometimes. They talk about raising the gas tax. Well, in the very next line, they says we should dedicate the revenues to fund road infrastructure. Well, if you raise the gas tax and dedicate the money to funding road infrastructure, that's not really going to do much for the overall budget picture. I guess you could maybe cut out revenue that's elsewhere, but unless you're just displacing that, that's not going to fly very far, and we'll be glad to make that point for them. Legalizing marijuana is a perennial issue. It could generate some money. That's not the reason Rio Grande Foundation would be excited about it, but if it happens because of this downturn, so be it. And then the just the ideas that like taxing cigarettes. You're not going to get a whole lot of money at this point from taxing cigarettes, especially with all the native reservations and native sales of cigarettes there to circumvent the tax issue. So
no, and cigarettes are not the item that they used to be in terms of percentage of smokers, and that's a theme that we've talked about on the podcast several times. Is there are no easy answers, and so the question also is, if we can't cut our way out of this crisis, can we spend our way out of it? That is the other side of the coin, if you will. And I think the answer is that, maybe there will be, and I don't want there to be. I don't think there should be. Maybe there will be some tax increases, but boy, you're going to have to take a good hard look at what we're spending our money on, because speaking of the new normal, I think it will hit state government big time.
No doubt about it. And we're not completely leaving that topic, because Rick Miera, former chairman of the House Education Committee in Santa Fe, he had an opinion piece recently in which he made the case, hey guys, we can't cut education spending. And, set aside for a second the fact that, Miera calls our education system in a crisis and was the chairman for many, many years in education, and kind of
so much for leaving a legacy, as it were. So
so he's out there talking about how we're in this education crisis. Okay, fine. You had years to solve that problem, being that you were on the education committee and your party controlled the entire legislative process for many, many moons. So there's that. But just to say, and education, if you include higher ed and K-12, K-12 is 46% of the budget. Higher ed is another 12%. Where else do you cut if you don't cut education, at least somewhat? Now, we could do this a variety of ways. You could cut education intelligently, or you can cut it in a very ill-advised way. But to not throw out some alternatives, to not say, here are things we should cut. It's not a helpful way to address the discussion. And we're seeing this right now. This is kind of the Voices for Children line as well.
Right.
There's no solutions-based program. It's just to paraphrase another famous saying, don't cut me, don't cut thee, cut the man behind the tree. You know, they're trying to pawn off these significant budget cuts that are undoubtedly going to come, and just saying, don't cut any of our programs, but we're not going to help you figure out what to cut.
Yeah, there are probably more sacred cows than there are. The supply of those is probably far greater than the demand with regard to what it's going to take for New Mexico fiscally to survive in the next couple of years.
Yeah, it's very frustrating to have that kind of rhetoric, but it's just another way for the Rio Grande Foundation to make inroads in Santa Fe, because we are going to be among the very small number that has actual solutions.
Right.
They may not. No politician of either party. I know that Democrats don't believe this, but no politician of either party likes to cut the budget. Republicans, as we've seen, especially in Washington, D.C., they love to spend money just as much as the Democrats.
Right.
It's just the Democrats like to raise taxes more. The Republicans like debt more. At the state level, you have fewer options to raise money. But the Rio Grande Foundation does believe that this situation needs to be done with cuts to the budget. There's a lot of simple cuts. There's a lot of challenging cuts. But we are asking all legislators, any legislator listening to this, anyone who has a relationship with their legislator who's listening to this, we're asking them to sign a pledge not to raise taxes at least through the end of the 2021 legislative session. You can go to riograndefoundation.org/pledge, and either you can take that pledge if you're a legislator or candidate, or you can ask your legislators to sign that. And just because they may be a conservative Republican that you think the world of doesn't mean that they have signed this pledge. They may not go to Santa Fe and raise taxes. They may pledge against that or say they won't, but you'd be surprised how many Republican legislators are reticent to sign that pledge for whatever reason.
Yes, economics in one lesson, it's the idea is that when the government takes money from a lot of people, that those many people aren't as powerful as the small constituency that gets the benefit of all those broadly collected taxes being concentrated for whatever group it is. So we will see. The other thing is, Paul, is talk a little bit about the idea of, okay, that's not a tax. We're going to just create a lot of fees and a lot of charges and a lot of other things. So what are your thoughts on that? Because I do think that is the other game that people play. It's like, oh no, I never raised taxes, but every fee that was charged by government went up 1,000%, you know.
Yeah. Well, our pledge is to not net raise taxes, which does leave room for tax reform if a miracle happens. I mean, I know. I have this conversation with Republican legislators, and they say, well, what if we get the opportunity to eliminate the grocery tax exemption and deal with some tax reform? And, you know, the Democrats had 2 years of record revenues. They could have reformed the tax situation, and they didn't touch it. There's no way in heck they are going to embark on fundamental tax reform in New Mexico's gross receipts tax at a time of unprecedented budget crisis. I just don't see them getting into that discussion at such a difficult juncture in our state's economic history. But that point being aside, fees, I think the difference first and foremost between a fee and a tax is there a reasonable correlation between the amount of the fee charged and the service provided? And when you start to break that relationship, if you have, a charge for $50 or something to register your car, I mean, you can say that is definitely outside the scope of what it would cost or what it should cost to process and keep the records on hand of people who have cars in the state of New Mexico, et cetera, et cetera. My point is not to debate whatever the fees are currently, but if you go and say, well, we're going to raise it 5% because it hasn't been raised for a few years, okay, I can understand that. Mm-hmm. But if you go and say, well, we're going to double it or triple it because hint, hint, wink, wink, suddenly we need this money, well, right. There you go. That's the discussion. And, New Mexico, to be fair, we're not like California. California, they have done that kind of thing a lot where they right. just take on new fees. And that's one of the things that people, you could go look it up. I'm not going to cite chapter and verse here, but the riots in Ferguson and all the situation that happened a few years back where people in the heavily African-American area of Ferguson were, Mike Brown, I believe was the guy's name, were dealing with a police force that was essentially being told by the local politicians, you have to raise the money for the state or for the local budget on the backs of fees, whether it's traffic tickets or pulling people over.
Civil forfeiture, right? Yeah. Was it into that? So.
Or your taillights burn out and you're going to charge them the full freight on the fee for that fine. Those kinds of things. Thankfully, New Mexico government has not been too terrible about. But, yeah, we will have our eyes and ears out, and we'll be pushing back against those increases. Now, we recently talked about grocery taxes in New Mexico, and you can go check out the story for yourself on KOB.com, or you can go to errorsofenchantment.com and see the story that Patrick Hayes did. He's an excellent reporter there at KOB, in which he talked to some various folks, including people in the administration, about the fact that if you get your groceries delivered, you can be paying taxes for every item that's a grocery in that particular transaction. And so you're going from groceries being untaxed to taxing at 7.8 or 8 or more percent, and it adds up very quickly. It turns out that as of Monday of last week, I think thanks to Patrick getting a hold of the governor's office and Tax and Rev, the state is applying for the pilot program to get grocery delivery tax-free under the food stamp program, which would then make grocery delivery not taxable in New Mexico.
Yes, because I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, presumably that social distancing is enhanced by like Instacart and these other food delivery services where one person goes and picks your groceries up and delivers them. The fact is they're a human and they're exposed in other things, so I'm not positive, but it seems like in this social distancing concept that it's presented, that seems like this is held out to be a good thing. Whether it really is or not, that's one of those things that I think in the research we'll have to see going forward. For somebody who's elderly and very...
for people who may have specific health issues that relate to the coronavirus and whatnot, they might not want to go into the store. For starters. Now, curbside pickup is not taxable. My family does that quite often, but maybe not all stores have curbside pickup. Right. Maybe they just have delivery or in store. And for a lot of folks, might be difficult or concerning to go down into the store, and they might want to get it delivered. And I don't know how long this whole waiver situation will take to work itself out, but they have been notified. They've gone ahead and made the waiver application to the federal government, which of course will cost New Mexico some level of money. I don't know how much they're currently getting from groceries delivering being taxed, But grocery taxation.
It's probably
something.
it's probably one of their larger sources of gross receipts tax because so few things are open other than hardware stores and,
Right.
Lowe's and Home Depot. So
Exactly. So the Rio Grande Foundation getting action out of folks in Santa Fe. And again, you can check out the story. It's embedded at heirsoфenchantment.com. Finally, Rio Grande Foundation's been doing its project called Liberty on Quarantine. Of course, we're used to seeing a lot of our friends and supporters on a regular basis at all manner of events. We have speakers. We have Liberty on the Rocks. This will be the second month in a row that's been canceled. We actually managed to get in because of the timing, second Monday of each month. We just got our March Liberty on the Rocks in under the wire, but April and now May are canceled. So between that happening and the fact that the candidates running for office, we talked about that a little bit just a few minutes ago, Wally, it's an unprecedented condition for people to be campaigning for office in, no matter what office they're in. But boy, we saw a 180-degree shift in our economy and so many of the issues that we've been talking about. And now these folks, we're starting with Senate candidates. Maybe the governor changes her order and we're on lockdown till June 15th. And suddenly the Rio Grande Foundation decides to go ahead and do Liberty on Quarantine with House of Representative candidates.
Right.
But the fact is that we've had an opportunity to sit down now with two of the three U.S. Senate candidates on the Republican side. And I'll be talking to Elisa Martinez this coming Wednesday.
Yeah, and there are just good old-fashioned knocking on doors, whether it's you or people on your behalf. Obviously, that's out of the situation.
Yep.
A lot of these races, particularly, now Senate race is different because it's statewide, so advertising, television can make some sense for that. But as we start to look at representatives and Senate candidates in New Mexico, you can buy a radio ad, but it's only going to hit, a very 5% of the people may even be able to vote for you. So you're wasting 95% of it. So it is interesting so that, the event of like the ones that Rio Grande Foundation would do in person are now being online. And I think that, depending on what the rules are, May 15th and beyond, we may see more of that. I think that's going to be a big part of this campaign more than anyone ever anticipated. And maybe people will be doing either throwing money at advertising, saying, I've got to do it some way, or possibly going more to social media that might be a little easier to target, get your message in front of the right people. Although, with that regard, there's a big campaign for the primary candidates for the conservative New Mexico state senators, and I'm seeing that. I can't vote for one of them, and I've seen their ads hundreds and hundreds of times online. So, maybe there'll be even online. It looks like maybe some people are already starting to just throw something against the wall and see if it sticks because they have no other options.
Yeah, and of course, Rio Grande Foundation is a statewide organization. I would love to have the time to go in and talk to all the various candidates in state Senate races, House of Representatives in New Mexico races. But being a statewide organization, we started off with the U.S. Senate. I talked to Gavin Clarkson a couple weeks ago, Mark Ronchetti last week, and now Elisa Martinez. Obviously those are the highest profile races going on right now in New Mexico. U.S. House of Representatives is also very big. And those folks aren't going to go door to door very often. They'll show up at big public events and talk to folks and do that kind of thing. Right. And of course, they'll do a lot of advertising. Legislative seats in New Mexico, that's a real game changer right now because those folks, it's traditionally, if you want to run a successful legislative race, you have to go door to door a lot because you can't, imagine you're running for state senate or even House of Representatives here in Albuquerque. And, you might pay a boatload of money for advertising that covers the entire city, and you're only benefiting from a tiny fraction of that. So I wish we could do more, but maybe we will. Liberty on Quarantine is what we have to offer, and it does pay to be a little tech savvy. Unfortunately, there's not many ways you can do these things without some kind of online connection, at least YouTube or Facebook. Zoom meetings is how we've done them, and it's tough for a lot of folks given all the Zoom security protocols that they've enacted to get people on Zoom. But yeah, check out our website, riograndefoundation.org. Subscribe on our Facebook feed, and you can participate this Wednesday evening in what could be the final Liberty on Quarantine. We'll see. 7 to 8 p.m., folks.
All right, very good.
All right, well, that's where we're going to leave it, Wally. Thanks for listening to this week's podcast. Make sure to get the latest edition of Tipping Point New Mexico by subscribing at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can post or comment on this and other episodes on Facebook and Twitter, and tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.